This is building security into your ArcGIS system. My name is Gregory Ponto. I'm a software security engineer with the security and privacy team at Esri. I'll introduce my colleagues.
Hi, my name is Adrien Hafner. I'm a system engineer in professional services.
My name is Buwembo. I'm part of the software security and privacy team and software dev.
All right, thanks, guys. So before we get started, I want to remind you that we value your feedback. Please use the Esri Events app to find our session. If you have comments, good or bad, we'll take all that into account. Helps us improve our content, improve our slides, improve our presentation. So we really appreciate any feedback you can provide in that application. Thank you. Getting right into it, we have kind of three areas to talk about today, starting with guidance, how to deploy a more secure ArcGIS enterprise or online environment. There is shared responsibilities in both these worlds, whether you're running ArcGIS Line or ArcGIS Enterprise. You have the power to affect various controls in these environments, and we will be covering guidance on how to improve that posture. There'll be some demos, of course. That's kind of the meat of the whole process. We will talk about authentication automation, talk about OAuth, API keys, sort of thing. And my colleagues will go into certificate management using tools like Let's Encrypt, very, very widely used tool. It's used by the federal government. It's used by Esri. So we encourage its use if you are managing certificates, at least to explore it, because it's a powerful free tool, and it's managed by a non-governmental organization that the federal government uses it too. And finally, round out with compliance, some of the updates where we are with ArcGIS Line in terms of authorization, ISO, that sort of thing. And then we'll, of course, do Q&A. So starting out with guidance, first thing I want to point out is from at trust.arcgis.com. This is commit this to memory or take a picture of the QR code. We have the hardening guide and the security advisor. So one of the questions that comes up a lot is, I have ArcGIS Line or I have ArcGIS Enterprise. What do I do to ensure that it's secure? And while these products are secure by default, those settings can be both tightened and loosened. And so it's easy to drift in either direction. And the hardening guide is intended to help keep you drifting in the direction of more secure as opposed to less secure. Now, the ArcGIS Hardening Guide is a fairly large document, something like 150 some odd pages. I would not recommend reading it like a book. It's meant as a reference. It is broken down into profile levels. You'll see throughout the whole document, the guidance will say basic or advanced. Basic is what is the baseline we should all shoot for. And the default settings in ArcGIS Online and Enterprise are mostly aligned to these basic settings. There are a few improvements that you can make though. And overall, the goal is to meet 95% of customers' basic security needs with basic controls. And these are gonna be things like, consider not allowing public sharing in your organization. Utilize multi-factor authentication. They might seem fairly obvious, but they're also the areas where we get the most common security incidents and cases where we have to investigate compromise on behalf of customers. Because what we most often see is not malicious actors directly attacking your organizations. They are settings that enable use of the product in a potentially dangerous way, right? Oversharing is the most common one, right? Allowing everyone in the organization to share publicly. That's a high risk posture to take, and it's one that can be mitigated with a flip of a switch. Now, as much as we're proud of the hardening guide and we maintain the hardening guide and we encourage you to look at it, it is a very deep document. It is very technical and it is very lengthy. And I would not wish that anyone just opens it up and tries to implement all these controls directly. Again, please use it as a reference. What I would suggest is going to trust.arcgis.com and opening up the security and privacy advisor. This advisor takes into account the basic controls, actually both basic and advanced controls, that are defined in the hardening guide. Now, it doesn't cover absolutely everything, but it does cover a functional baseline, and you can use it to essentially audit your ArcGIS Line or Enterprise environment. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump right in there. Happen to be using single sign-on, so it'll just take me right in. And this is going to audit my organization. It's going to look for high-risk settings. And the guidance I will offer you here is look at the reds, right? Work on mitigating the red items here. Those are the most critical risk issues that are present in the organization. And you want to at least work through those. So top example that came up in my organization, yours may have different findings, is the presence of legacy API keys that are on the deprecation path. If you use these, there's a risk that your applications will break if you don't work on migrating to the modern API keys. The API key model that was released, I think, in 2004. So that's just one example. These are items that are issues that could have operational impact to your organization. And the modern API keys have more capabilities and privileges. We'll talk about that today. Now, another one, and the one I mentioned is one of the most common sources of organizational compromise, or at least spillage, it's really what it is oversharing. Allowing everyone in your organization to share their content publicly is a very high-risk position to take. So we don't recommend you do that by default. That's a very deliberate decision. And if you're doing that, be prepared to apply a fair amount of governance to those processes. One of the most common sources of spillage we see is cases where the organization has hundreds or thousands of users, and they've enabled this ability. They didn't realize that they were sharing that content to the public, or they didn't realize the content was as sensitive as it was. And then there's a need to figure out who saw it and how far it got exposed and that sort of thing. So we really don't want you to end up in that situation. So strongly consider disabling public sharing in your organization. Only enable that if you're deliberately intending to use it as a tool for distributing public content. Some organizations are actually using separate orgs for this purpose because that powerful feature is so high risk. And as you see these items in the advisor, there's going to be deep links that'll take you to your organization. I you to look at those settings directly so you can just kind of jump to mitigate them. So I'm going to go ahead and mitigate this one real quick. As I said, the one that it's complaining about here is members who are not administrators can make their content public, right? So I'm just going to shut that off. I'm actually going to shut these three off because I don't really need, I may not want to have social media links or may not need to do that. I may want to control how far users can see content in my organization, but I definitely want to limit how far they can share. So going right into that, we'll go back to the advisor. Now I'm going to go ahead and log out and log in, and we'll take a look at did it change. And yeah, so that feature is now green. And that's kind of the goal. We're going through these items, working through the reds, making them other than red, yellow or green. Now, the yellow items here, they're warnings. They aren't necessarily high risk, but they are areas that you can improve to additionally harden the organization. In the context of our hardening guide, where I talked about kind of like basic and advanced posture, the basic controls that are out of alignment will show up as red. The advanced controls that are out of alignment will show as yellow. So aim for the basic posture and work on those. Those are going to be your highest risk items to mitigate and resolve. And then once you get to a basic security posture, consider looking at the advanced ones. But the advanced settings, they do have operational impact usually. So we reserve those for organizations that have critical software requirements, critical infrastructure, high compliance requirements, that sort of thing. And you're welcome to explore those. But the basics are designed not to break anything, just to improve the security posture of our organization. The advanced controls do have operational impact. They're usually constraining capabilities and putting in controls that can actually block operations. So that's a position you want to take as kind of an iterative practice. So that's a quick view of the Security and Privacy Advisor. So again, if you're take nothing else away, please take a look at the Security and Privacy Advisor off of trust.arcgis.com. It's not going to change anything in your organization. You can run it. It doesn't have the ability. It's not going to adjust any settings. You're in complete control of that. It's a tool to help you identify areas of risk in your org and work through those changes. And yeah, I just went ahead and demoed that. So pivoting to some of the developer workflows. Want to talk about automation and authentication, specifically topics like API keys and app auth. Now, these are powerful developer tools. Every developer pretty much needs to authenticate at some point to ArcGIS Online or ArcGIS Enterprise. And these authentication tools will essentially help you do that. So the first thing I wanted to cover is a feature called API keys. These were released in 2004, mid 2004, something like that. They really help solve a problem where we didn't have a effective way of automating process authentication, like headless authentication, machine authentication. We always supported user authentication. That was Identity Manager class, which is available in all of our SDKs and all of our APIs, but there was not really a good story for handling headless authentication, process authentication, CI/CD authentication, that sort of thing. So API keys do provide a solution for that. Now, I kind of mark this red because they are not without risk, because they are static authenticators. You can grant them a variety of privilege. You can grant them all the way up to administrative privilege. And these authenticators are passed by the process to the service, and they authenticate the call. They're a lot like a GitHub PAT in that regard, or maybe an SSH key. They're not unsecure by their nature, but they are live authenticators that expire in up to 1 year. So there's a lot of risk in misusing those. And if you use them within a process, that's fine, provided that you're storing that API key in a proper secret store. So like in GitHub, that would be like a GitHub action, GitHub secrets, Jenkins secrets, and AWS KMS, Azure Key Vault, all those sorts of things are fine places to store these keys if you're going to use them. And you'd feed them into your processes as typically environment variables. What you don't want to do is bake them into your code. And one of the worst risks I've seen, and this really started happening once this feature was released in 2024. I said 2004 several times. 2024 is that we saw these getting put into public web applications. Please never do that, because if you put an API key in a public web application and that web application is running on a user system, they can pull it out and they can use it. And especially if it's a public web application, anyone can use it. Again, they're static authenticators. So they're really easy to use, they're really convenient, but they are powerful and they are potentially dangerous if they're not used in a responsible way. And the responsible way is to use them within a process or limit their privilege so far that if they were exposed, you wouldn't care. So that would be something like rate limiting access or maybe consuming credits for like a premium service. That's kind of their use case outside of just process authentication. And as I said, the real sin here, right, is using them this way. So using an API key inside of a user application is extremely high risk. If you're doing this now, I'd strongly suggest moving to user identity authentication instead. The fact is, doing this actually is an impersonation technique anyway. So if you have an API key baked into a user application, you're going to lose the user identity context. So there's not a lot of value in doing this, but we have seen it. And so I just urge organizations to move to user authentication flows as opposed to putting API keys in user applications. And yeah, I said high risk, right? And the last thing I will kind of cover, and let's get to demos after this, is app auth. And app auth is another way to support process authentication against content. So this would be like a way to authenticate a headless process while you're supporting MFA or whatever in your organization for the purpose of working with content. The app auth method is a slightly more involved process. This is going to require, it's not terribly difficult, but it's a little bit of orchestration where you pass a client ID, client secret that's associated with an app item in ArcGIS Line. Doing that returns an access token. Now, everything that ArcGIS uses for the purpose of authentication is based on OAuth, bearer tokens, or access tokens. So that's a synonymous concept for us. To access content, to authenticate against content. Even when you're publishing, you're using Pro, you're using mobile apps, using processes, you're always ultimately passing an OAuth access token, also known as an OAuth bearer token, to the content for the purpose of authentication. That is that green access token. Now, it's green because it has a very short expiration, and it is scoped. So obviously, you don't want these to be compromised, but if they were written to like a log file or something, and even administrative organizations saw it, they couldn't use it because by the time they see it, it is useless. They last minutes. Their timeline is measured in minutes, and this is something you can control. The longest you can possibly extend these is 2 weeks, and I don't really recommend you take them that far. By default, I think they're 30 minutes. So the best practice for handling process authentication at this time, right, is to, and this is industry standard. This is how we see Azure doing this. We see AWS doing this. We see Google doing this. This is like the industry standard for OAuth authentication is to use client secret exchange for access tokens, which are also known as OAuth bearer tokens, and passing those generated tokens to the content along with the payload you're attempting to publish or the content you're trying to change, that sort of thing. And that authenticates the request. So let's get into some demos and kind of talk about how this rubber really meets the road. So I mentioned a couple different types of authentication, and I want to direct you to developers.arcgis.com and this section, which is also in the PowerPoint slides, and these slides are available to you, so you don't really have to memorize these screens, but just want to kind of cover it again. There are 3 types of authentication. So we talked about API key authentication. That's a method by which you can authenticate a process with a long-lived static authenticator. It is an acceptable method of authenticating a process, but it is a very dangerous method of authenticating a user. In fact, it doesn't authenticate a user, has no user context. And so if you're building like an application that's going to run on a phone or run on a tablet or run on a system or run on a web browser, you're going to want to use user authentication for that. And user authentication makes use of what's called the identity manager. And there's some really good tutorials on this page that kind of cover how to do that. So I would direct you to looking at these flows. Anytime you're doing user-driven authentication, interactive authentication, where you want to have the user's context, you need to use user authentication. And so there's a variety of, all of our SDKs and APIs support this, and they all support this using a class called the identity manager, which I will kind of just quickly point out. Yeah, identity manager, right? And this has been around for quite a while, really for I think more than a decade. And it's common to all of our APIs. So if you're using front-end applications that are going to run in web browsers, in mobile devices, you want to use the identity manager. You don't want to roll your own exchange methodology. Don't use API keys for this. You don't use app auth for this. It won't really help you. You want the user's context. And by using the identity manager in code like this, it's going to pop up and prompt the user for a login when they interact with the application, which is generally what you want because you want their identity. So that's just a quick overview of identity manager and user authentication. What I'm going to kind of focus on though is the more like the process authentication, because we get a lot of since user authentication is well established and identity manager is a class that all of our SDKs support. Most people here, if they build applications, probably already using it. How we handle process headless authentication is less well understood, and so in that frame, I'm going to talk about API key authentication and app authentication. So API key authentication is a matter of creating an item in your organization, developer credential item, and you have these options. So I mentioned the 3 types: user authentication, app authentication, API key authentication. This is the flow for web applications, for mobile devices, for browsers, for desktop applications. This is the flow that's going to challenge a user for their identity, and you'll have that identity context. So when we're operating the application, you can know who they are. You can use things like editor tracking and track the changes relative to them. So when in doubt, use user authentication. If you're like, I'm not sure what to do, start here. When you get, if you always start here, you're not going to go wrong. Now, if you're doing automated process authentication, something like out of a GitHub action or a Jenkins job, this isn't going to work for you. It's going to become real obvious because you're not going to have a way to get the identity of the Jenkins system because it's not a human, and that's going to lead you to OAuth app authentication or API key authentication. So I'll start with API key authentication, and just quickly kind of run through the wizard here that takes us with the process of creating these. Now, the lowest risk privilege is simply to say, I want to put an API key in an application that is going to work with public content. This really, the use case here is to consume credits on behalf of, consume your credits to support some process or even some user-driven interface like a premium base map or something like that. Now, I realize that most organizations want to do more than that. They want to do privileged access. So I'm going to jump into that section and just kind of go through that. And so in this workflow, what we're going to be able to do is grant access scope. We're going to scope the access of this API key to just one service. So if you're using AppAuth or any kind of process authentication, you should really think about, how do I scope this? Because if you don't scope it, it's going to have your privilege. If you're an administrator, it's going to have administrator privilege. So please, please, please scope these API keys or AppAuth items to ideally one service, because they're usually purpose-built for one intent. You can create as many of these as you want. So create one for every workflow that you need to support and scope that to the single service you want to operate. So I'm scoping this to my demo service. It's a feature layer. I'm actually not going to give it any privilege at all. I don't need to give it, my intention in this case is to just allow it to edit a feature. So I'm just scoping it to one feature. I'm not giving it any more advanced privilege than that. When in doubt, least privilege, right? If it doesn't work, go back and increase the privilege. You can always do that. You see the expiration date will default to something like 3 months out. You can go as far as a year out. I realize pretty much everyone's going to do that, so I'm not going to pretend that I'm not going to do that. I'll just go ahead and put it to 2027. I realize everybody will pretty much do this. So we're in March, right? So today's, yeah, whatever. So that's, a year out. Very, very common to take the full year. That's fine. And, just know that they will eventually expire and you will need to rotate them. I'll just call this API key demo. Okay. Yeah, so I have an API key. It's scoped to one layer, has no other privilege. Hit next. I'm going to go ahead and generate the key right now. And I'm not afraid to show this, even though I'm administrating this organization, because this API key is scoped. Even if you did get a hold of it, and I will, of course, validate it after the session, but even if you get a hold of it, the only thing you could do is maybe break my demo. So because it's scoped, it has no other privilege. So I would just basically take this and I would put it into my code. Right? So I would just replace this API key with the one I just generated. And let's give this a quick test. And so this is a really simple, ultra simple application. All I'm doing here is I'm passing that API key as a bearer token in the header of my application. This application would be intended to serve as a back-end process. Maybe this is a sensor that's sending data to a service that says, hey, there's a problem. That's kind of the concept here, right? So I'm just updating a feature service with a payload that this translates to alert, and passing that API key as a OAuth bearer token in the authorization header. And let's go ahead and let that run. And what this is going to do is it is going to reset. So I have this map, right? And underneath this, within this map is a feature layer. And all these points are green. All these sensors are in an OK state. So what the code that I just ran, what it's doing, let's make this bigger. Yeah, so this code that I just ran, it just went ahead and updated all of those points to be green, right? I'm gonna take another Python script, and it's very much the same concept, except it's going to turn some of these features red. It's gonna say, hey, one of these sensors is in alert state. So I'm gonna go ahead and run that. Yeah, so it's gonna pick a random value here, and one of these points will, hopefully, if my demo works, will turn red. There it is. And it's going to keep updating them. It's going to look for new points. It's going to say, hey, we got an alert here, we got an alert here. It's just a feature service. I'm just updating the feature service and the property of status to alert, right? This is all using an API key. So I'll go ahead and stop that, and we'll just reset it. Again, it's an API key passed as an OAuth bearer token, a static authenticator, updating content. That's all it's doing. Okay, so that's how we use an API key. It's very simple, and if you're using it in a backend process, it's fine. But if I were to put that in a public application, if I were to put this in like a web application, I realize this is a web application, but this code is not running in this web application. This is a backend process running like on a, say, a Jenkins server or a GitHub Action, or in the sensor itself, right? But if I have that API key baked into this application itself, then I'm exposing that key for anyone to use outside the context of my application. So that's the risk, right? Please don't use those in public applications. Okay, so going back to this, let's see here. We'll go to my next demo. Yeah, so what I just showed was this, right? And it works, right? And it's easy. And again, warning against this, putting that API key in a user application. Very dangerous thing to do. Please don't do that. Now, moving ahead, a little more advanced and recommended process is to not pass the static authenticator, but instead pass a client ID client secret, which is a slightly different type of item. In this case, I'm going to pass a client ID client secret. I'm going to get an access token. Now, the API key is an access token, right? But this is a short-lived scope token as opposed to a long-lived static authenticator. This token will live for, I don't know, 30 minutes or something. So if it does get exposed, it's only exposed for 30 minutes. If it's written to a log, it's only live for 30 minutes. Whereas if the API key gets written to a log, it's live for a year. It's probably live when someone sees it. Okay, so let's show that. Slight variation of the same demo. To create these, we're gonna go, so we'll close that, create a new one, content. And developer credentials. So I showed the API key method. Now we're going to look at app auth. So here I'm going to go create this, and it says, access token duration up to 2 weeks, right? So not up to 1 year, but up to 2 weeks. By default, it's 30 minutes, I believe. And you can constrain this depending on how you make that request. You can say, I only want it to be 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. You have that control. So I'm going to create this. It's a very similar flow. So I'm going to say private application with selected privileges and access, right? I'm going to grant access to items I own. Now you can go further with this, but the safest thing to do is either no access at all. That's not very powerful, not very useful. But to grant items specifically scoped to a service that we want to interact with. So I'm going to go back to my demo service, add that in. Not going to give it any privilege because all I want to do is update a feature service. The fact that I've given it scoped access to that one service is all I really need to do. And you can also do things like publish content. You can give it administrative privilege. Be very careful when you do that, because it's going to have the power to change your organization. When in doubt, least privilege. I just want to update a feature service. Just going to give it access to that only. So we'll call this app auth demo. Okay, it's very similar, right? Just has scoped access to the same service, doesn't have any other privilege, and gonna hit create. Now this is not gonna generate an API key. What it's gonna generate is a client ID, client secret. So let's take a look at that. Yeah, so here's our client ID, here's our client secret. Now it does give us a temporary token with the purpose of testing, but that token, expires in 2 hours. This is not gonna be very useful for like baking it into a backend process. So you're not gonna wanna do that. What you'll want to do is exchange the client ID and the client secret for a access token on the fly. So I'll go ahead and show how we do that. So I'll take this client ID, and put it like this, client secret, slightly different code, okay? So instead of API key, I'm using client ID and client secret. Now this is industry standard OAuth right here. And again, I wouldn't normally recommend broadcasting this, to the World Wide Web, but that content it's scoped. I'm not too worried. It's a demo. If someone wants to break it, be my guest. I'll also obviously invalidate it after the session. You should not do that though. But nonetheless, so I've got this baked in now, and now my code is a little different here. It's similar. What I've done, it's like the same exact code. Like this part is exactly the same. What is different is I've added this function, and this function is exchanging the client ID, client secret against the OAuth token endpoint within ArcGIS Online. And on developers@arcgis.com, there's code on how to do this. There's tutorials on how to do this, right? This is basically pulled right out of that tutorial. And I'm going to call that function, pass the client ID, client secret in, and return the access token. So that's the only real difference. And when I break it down, it's very, very similar. In this case, I'm pulling the environment variables client ID, client secret, right? So instead of an API key, I'm using a client ID, client secret. I'm going to go ahead and I'll start with reset features. So let's get to that one. Okay. Let's look at my map. Okay. Right. Okay. Well, features reset, but we'll do it again anyway. So right now I'm running the reset features variant with the access token, or the client ID, client secret exchange to return an access token. The access token, again, just like an API key, it is a bearer token. I'm going to pass it in the authorization header, and I'm going to use it to authenticate against the map. So I do debug. Okay, so it's updating the features. Obviously, features are already green, so not much is going to change there. Just want to make sure that works. Now I'm going to use very similar code. Again, it's just the only thing I've done is added a function to exchange client ID, client secret for an access token. That's what I've done here. So I'm going to run that now. And there we go, right? So it just updated that feature. It's picking a random feature, it updated it, right? Now that's set to alert. So right now, this exchange, what's going on is it's actually doing a client ID, client secret exchange for an access token. And let me go ahead and stop it and put a breakpoint in here to kind of illustrate that that's actually happening. Okay, so client ID, client secret, returns access token. There's the access token, short-lived token. And then when we do the header injection here, putting an access token into the bearer token field, we will look at I'll go ahead and have this go to the next step. And here we see header. This is the key. I really want to hammer this home. All of our services, everything, ultimately boils down to passing an OAuth bearer token as an authorization header. Every single thing in ArcGIS Line and Portal is using that because that's an OAuth standard. So you hear the term ArcGIS token, you hear the term API key, you hear the term access token. These are OAuth bearer tokens. And I get questions like, what if I'm using MFA? What if I'm using SAML? How do I deal with that? All of those are precursors to getting the access token. So you can use SAML with this. You can use MFA with this. You can use OIDC with this. It all works fine. Because at the end, even when you're logging in as a user, they are getting an ArcGIS Pro. You're getting an OAuth bearer token. And that is what is being passed to the services for publishing, for editing, for everything. It's an OAuth standard. So that's what this is all based on. And yeah, so I can let this continue to run, and we'll see these continue to update. And again, the logic here is maybe I have a sensor, right, that's looking for some alert criteria, and it's going to start, flagging certain areas as alerts. And with that, I will pass this over there. So it's running here. It's updating the code to my colleague to shift to encryption with Let's Encrypt.
There's some questions for OAuth, but we could probably move them to the end.
At the end, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Awesome job. Thanks, Greg. All right, so I'm going to go over certificates a little bit. Working in professional services, it seems like it's a topic that can sometimes be really confusing. And I also get a lot of questions when we're doing migrations or deployment automation or things like that. Should we be using a self-signed certificate? Should we be using a public CA certificate? Or domain certificates okay? And so I'm going to provide just a little bit of conceptual background that'll hopefully clear up the picture for like what those different certifying authorities can be used for and what the differences between the different types of certificates are. And then I have a few quick slides to kind of show how you can create your own private key certificates and certificate chains using a free public CA. All right, so first of all, what about certificates? Like a lot of times people know what they are, like yes, we use them in our applications, but what are we actually using them for? There are two main purposes that certificates provide. So first is encryption, and that's basically our private key certificates. And so some typical formats that you might see for your private key certificates, PFX, P12, sometimes PEM. And our software accepts a lot of these different formats when you're importing them into the application backends. But the purpose of those, whenever you have a private key included, the main purpose is encryption. The other purpose we have for certificates is trust. And that's whenever we're importing things that we need. And the purpose of trust or a certificate chain is to get back to that certifying authority and understand that the certificate that we're actually presenting to users or traffic that's inbound to our endpoint is actually trusted and certified by an authority. And one other clarifying point here is that the private key certificates that include a password are also included as part of that certificate chain. So even if you have a valid root certificate, for example, if there's something wrong or invalid about your private key certificate, the certificate chain will also be broken. And typical formats that you might see for these trust certificates or the certificates that are just for trust do not have the private key associated with them unless it is a certificate chain. And so common formats for those are .crt, .cer, PEM can also be included sometimes. And so, yeah, those are the two main features, the two main properties that we turn to certificates to help us with. Okay, so high level, how do the certificates work? We start with a certifying authority, and now in this case, when I'm referring to the example here, I am referring to something that might be a domain certifying authority or a public certifying authority. When we talk about self-signed certificates, we're not going to have this full chain that you see on the slide, because when we have a self-signed certificate, the certifying authority is the machine that is issuing and also presenting the certificate. So in that case, we have a chain, but the chain is literally just one single certificate. And that's, the same as me saying like, hey, I am who I say I am, trust me. I don't have anybody else, any government authority saying, yes, I've issued her a social security number or a birth certificate or anything like that to prove that I am who I say I am. But in this case, the certifying authority, if it's a public or a domain certifying authority, would issue the root certificate, and then the root certificate can issue the intermediate certificate. And then the intermediate certificate step is optional, but in larger certifying authority chains, you'll often see an intermediate authority. And that's just because it narrows the scope down even further, which adds some additional protections and easier management as well. And so from the intermediate certificate, if you have one in your chain, the leaf entity certificate gets issued. Now, one other clarifying feature is with the root and the intermediate certificates, when those are issued, they also do get a private key. I didn't illustrate them in this slide because really the private key that we're concerned with is going to be that leaf entity certificate private key. And the leaf entity certificate is kind of the end of the chain. That is for the machine or the host that is presenting the certificate. And so this is the full chain as you would typically see it. All right, so here I want to highlight the certificates that are used specifically for trust or for building that trust. And those would be the root and the intermediate. In this case, what we're looking for is when we present that leaf entity certificate, when we go to an endpoint and we see, what used to be the lock icon, which is now, various icons depending on the browser you're using, that shows us that the traffic is trusted. What that means is that the certificate that's being presented can be validated and verified by an intermediate certificate and also if one exists, and also a root certificate. And what that means is that we're getting all the way back to the certifying authority, which if it's a public CA, it might be something like DigiCert or Entrust or GoDaddy or any of those large certifying authorities, AWS Certificate Manager. If it's a domain certificate, what that means is that it's being validated by the domain for which it's issued from. And something to be mindful of is, so a lot of times, well, should I use a domain cert or should I use a public cert? A public cert is typically, you have to pay for those typically, but if you're dealing with anything that has a public-facing endpoint, you will need one because your domain certifying authority cannot validate an internet address because it's not within the domain that it has a scope over. And the FQDN for the domain is not going to be the same as a public address. So this is about building the trust back to the chain so that the certifying authority can say, yes, I know this is valid, I'm putting my stamp of approval on it. So, and then like I mentioned, if you're looking for if something is trusted, you can look for in a browser like the lock icon or some like in Google Chrome and Edge, there's like a little like filter icon now. You can click on that and you can see that the connection is secure that way, and also the certificate is valid, and you could even check it out and look at the details and see the full chain back to the CA. So the bottom line is what about it? Like, what does this mean? So if a connection isn't trusted, what that means is that we can't guarantee that the website that we're visiting or the endpoint that we're visiting is legitimate because there's no certifying authority putting the stamp of approval on it. All right, so then switching gears to the encryption part of this. So what's involved in the encryption? That is strictly the private keys that require the passwords when we use them. And what that does is any traffic that is intended or targeting the endpoint that's presenting the private certificate will be encrypted, and then it can only be decrypted once it gets to the endpoint that has the key to decrypt it with. And so again, why do we care about this? So if something isn't encrypted, doesn't have the private key, or it doesn't have a valid private certificate, the traffic may not be encrypted, and it could be intercepted if we're passing sensitive information in plain text. And then also, if we're trying to visit an application that has HTTPS traffic enforced on it, the traffic may not get to the intended endpoint. And so indications that you have a certificate, or you're using a private key certificate, or that you have encrypted traffic, you would be using HTTPS protocol whenever you're visiting the site. And then as far as configuration with ArcGIS Enterprise, anytime you visit that import existing server certificate function within ArcGIS server portal, and you're providing a password, anytime we provide a password, that's an indication that we are using a private certificate. Okay, so then just like a real world example to kind of help drive all of this home. So in the case of Amazon, right, we go shopping on Amazon's website. In this case, we're calling them the certifying authority, because what they are issuing is the leaf entity certificate. In this case, is your username. So everyone has an account. And how do we make sure that nobody else can say that they are your username? There's a password generated, and that's the private encryption key analogy in this case. And then, so what's the purpose of that when it comes to like reviewing products and figuring out what you should buy, what's recommended, what's not recommended? We have, there's a lot of bots out there. There's a lot of people that get paid to write reviews who don't actually use the products. And then there are also malicious actors who go out there and try to damage the reputation of other products that they've never used just for their own benefit. So with the combination of the leaf entity certificate and the private key, which is your identity in this case, Amazon says, like, yes, I can verify that this person has actually purchased this product before you leave a review, so that, like I said, what's at stake, product influence and reputation, which could be positive or negative. So just an example to kind of show how this all works together, ties together the chain of trust back to the certifying authority, which is Amazon in this case, and then also making sure that you are who you say you are, and nobody else can access your credentials, and you are the owner of that private key, would be the equivalent of your password for the account. Okay, so on to the demo. So Let's Encrypt, if you're not familiar, it's an organization that serves as a private CA on the internet, and it is free. Sorry, did I say private? I meant public. A public CA on the internet. It is free. And basically, it only has a couple of requirements. The first is that you do need access to a DNS service, and not only access, but you need the ability to create a text record within the DNS. And it's just temporary, but it's so that you can register or actually build the chain of trust back to the Let's Encrypt certifying authority. And then you also need to install the application for Let's Encrypt, which is called Certbot locally. And this can be run from any Windows machine, Linux machine. It is Mac OS works as well. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to download the installer for Certbot and run it. It's very lightweight, simple, easy to run. And then the next thing you're going to do, in this example, I'm using Windows OS. But what you're going to do is you're just going to open command prompt session, and you're going to use this command. And basically what we're doing is we are creating, we're telling Certbot which DNS domain we want to use to generate the trust. So we're going to provide the name of our domain. And what it's going to do is it's going to generate a string that we can use for our text record that we're going to enter into our DNS. And in this screenshot here, you can see like we have the random string of characters that we're then going to provide. You kind of just wait here because now you need to switch over to your DNS system to add that record. In my case, I'm using AWS Route 53. So I go in there, and the important thing here is that the record name needs to be this exact thing, which it provides in the previous step, _acme-challenge. And then we're just going to enter the value that was provided for the text record and update the text record within the DNS. Okay, and then we are going to wait for that to be publicly available. And then so what I did in this case is I just opened another session and I did an NS lookup looking for that value, the underscore acme dash challenge. And I saw what the result was, and I just made sure that that text record matched what was provided to me by Certbot in the previous step. And that tells me that it's updated, it's ready to go, I can use it now. And what this is actually doing with relation to the trust is it's saying, okay, yes, Let's Encrypt or Certbot now can recognize that you do have access and you are part of the domain that you've supplied in that first step, because you've proven that you can add a record to it and it updates and it matches. Okay, and then after that is updated and everything looks good, you're ready to continue. So it's just as simple as pressing enter in that first session that you have in command prompt. And then what it's going to do is it's going to tell you that it's successfully generated a few certificates for you. And so it's going to generate a full chain, which is going to include the root and an intermediate certificate, as well as their private key certificate. And then it's also going to generate one called priv key, which, as it sounds, is just the private key. And that is going to be saved by default in the location that you've installed Certbot in. And then you can see here, that's what it looks like. And so these are all PEM format. Like I said, the PEM format can be used. That's totally fine. Optionally though, so a lot of times I like to just create PFX certificates because they're sometimes more portable with the different applications. So I use OpenSSL to change my private key certificate into a PFX. And so since it's OpenSSL, it's easier to use Linux because it's natively available there. So I just went into a Windows subsystem Linux system, and I used this command to just basically change my private key PEM into a PFX file. And then you can see that that's there now. And then another optional step, I guess I just really don't like PEM files. So I had the PFX that I created from the priv key. And then using Key Store Explorer, I also take the full chain and I sometimes export that so that it's in a .cer, .crt, but again, just for portability and ease of use in different types of applications. And so to do that, you're just going to open the existing key store. You're going to, in this case, you can use the PFX because I've exported it with the full chain. And so export full chain, and I'm choosing the entire chain so that I have the root and the intermediate included in my PFX, because one of the features in Enterprise starting at 11.3 is if you import a PFX file into the portal or ArcGIS server, admin API will actually import any root or intermediate that are included in that trust chain for you automatically. And then I exported that as a CER. And then whenever I open the CER, you can see I do actually have the full chain now. So I've got the root, I've got the intermediate, and I have my leaf entity certificate, which I just actually made a wildcard.
Thank you, Greg and Adrien. In the interest of time, I wanted to shift gears a little bit. So Greg and Adrien have been talking about encryption and authentication, but I wanted to shift gears into some questions in the queue because there are some interesting questions that I figured you guys can share. I promise you, I'm not trying to stiff you guys of a compliance discussion, but you guys might benefit from these questions. Is that okay if we switch it? Okay. The first question in the queue is from Chris. So they're asking, to which content can I grant access to OAuth app items? Is it only my content or any other user in the org?
Yeah, so the question being asked is a really good one. It goes to like when I'm creating an API key or an app ID for the purpose of client secret exchange and accessing content. Can I only work with content I own? That used to be the case. This changed last year. So as of last year, you can grant access to any content in your organization as long as the person who is creating that item in fact has access to that content. It's possible to grant the app item access to a group that has access to the content. So yes, and this is kind of like, it was a nuance in my section that talked about kind of legacy versus modern API keys and app auth. Again, in 2025, late 2025, so pretty recently, this change was made available. Yes, you can now grant access to more than just content you own. You can grant it to content that you have rights to. Obviously, not more than that. Yeah.
Okay, so I think you answered another question of that was related to can I grant it and who owns. So the other question is who should own the API keys? Best practice. What would you recommend?
Oh, what is the best practice to who should own the API key? Well, the reality of it is the person that creates the the item is the owner, and that can't be changed, right? So like, yeah, this is kind of an organizational decision, but yeah, if you're creating these, you become the owner, and it's not something you can actually change.
So do you recommend that they create the user who owns the keys, but and just the purposes of creating keys or not?
I see. So the question is like, should I create a dedicated user for the purpose of creating and managing API keys and app IDs? I don't think I would recommend that. I mean, you could do that, but I don't really have a firm recommendation either way, because ultimately, the organization is going to have to think about how they want to manage ownership of these items. Yeah, it comes down to, if you're creating the item, you are the owner. But it's an interesting question. We probably should offer some.
Okay. And we can take that offline and provide some guidance too.
Can we take one more on the virtual, and then I'll go for
Okay.
questions in
Yeah.
the audience, and maybe we'll circle
Good
back.
point.
Is there any more?
The other one was, is there any effect on adding OAuth app items to groups, or these are independent levels of granting access?
So the question is, can we add OAuth app items to groups?
To groups.
Yes, you can.
Okay.
That feature was released late last year. So yes, that is possible now. It's a privilege, but yes, there's a privilege you can grant to the OAuth app ID item to allow it to join groups.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So that feature was released in 2000.
We want to open up to the flow.
Yeah.
If anybody has any
I got
questions.
one over here, and we'll maybe grab 2 or 3 more. Please.
Are there any plans to shift from the hardening guide to a loosening guide?
That's an interesting question. Okay, so the question that was asked is, are we planning to offer a loosening guide as opposed to a hardening guide? Can you elaborate a little bit on that one?
Basically deploy a setups like applying all defaults that are set in the hardening guide that are reasonable, and then allow to loosen as required.
Right. I mean, so I guess my answer to that would be, the start with the defaults, establish the baseline based on what we recommend in the hardening guide, and then from there, organizations can certainly choose to regress those settings as they need. And there's legitimacy to this, right? I mentioned public sharing, right? We recommend not enabling that feature, but lots of people need to do that, right? So that's certainly an organizational decision. And there are plenty of organizations, many organizations, probably most do that. We just recommend it as a starting point to consider revoking that privilege, because it is the most common issue we see in product security incident response is oversharing. And I didn't realize that was sensitive content. I didn't realize I was sharing to the public. Those kinds of questions and issues come in, and they lead to spillage and a lot of investigative effort on all sides to figure out, who saw the content and how far did it spill, and et cetera. So, yeah, but we don't plan on offering a loosening guide.
So, but
I apologize for the. I didn't mean to
to
laugh,
add
but
to
yeah.
your point is there is an effort, not yet current, but there's an effort on picking some of the basic items in the hardening guide and make them defaults in the implementation. We're not promising that it's going to be in 12.1 or something, but that effort is in play.
Okay. And I saw, yes, sir.
The security guide, or the security advisor.
Yes.
Installed programmatically, I can see very much where I would love to be able to say, call this every 30 minutes. If there's anything that pops up, go ahead and have that appear on the dashboard.
Yeah, it's great question, and it's a common ask. Yeah, so that's something we're looking at, is making, it's not available now, but let me repeat the question. Question was, will there be a way for us to, or is there a way for us to utilize the security advisor, calling it programmatically, automation, et cetera? We've had this request, multiple sources. So yeah, it's something we're looking at, but it's not available at this time. That's, oh yeah, no, I'll come back.
We'll get back.
Sir, yeah, please, go ahead.
So when we use Let's Encrypt to generate the certificate, you just specify like a wildcard. Can you specify SAN values?
It is, I don't think you can actually, not within the simple command that I used.
But yeah, the question is to elaborate a little bit more. So can you do subject alternative name certificates with Let's Encrypt? Absolutely, you can. It's
But not within the format that I used, yeah.
Yeah. There's a flag, you just have to set it. Yeah. It is possible, yes, it's possible. And then, please, I think it's the last one we can take, and then we have to.
Actually, expanding on the first question,
Sure.
why would you use an API user if you had an application? This is just a scenario. If you had an application that you had OAuth users that are doing some stuff, but you had back-end application doing stuff against the token, you would want that, in my mind, you would want that token that's impersonating that user that updates the data in that particular item to be located and say, yes, that's the application that's doing the back end stuff. I would think that would be notable for that. Wouldn't that be the case for that?
So let me try to paraphrase the question, attempt to answer it. Well, I'll say this. So yeah, if you have back-end processes like I was showing, updating content, the editor tracking, or even the audit logs, in ArcGIS Inline, History API, activity logs, will show that those changes were made by an API key or an app ID as opposed to a user. If a user is making those changes using user identity, which is where I sign in as a user and I have my context, those changes will show up as a user. Yeah. So they're two distinct patterns. The user auth flow, which I didn't really show, but it's in the developers.arcgis.com guide, and it's the most standard way of doing this, is going to challenge a user, and it's going to ask them for their credentials, however you set that up, username, password, MFA, SAML to Entra, or OIDC, or whatever. It's going to get their user context. They're going to have a username and an ID, and that ID will present in the activity logs and in like editor tracking fields. So yeah, if you're using basically if you're using a website, a web application, or a mobile device, that kind of thing, ArcGIS Pro, it'll all show up as a user. And this is kind of why I really try to hammer the point home of using an API key embedded in an application that a user is using for the purpose of authenticating against private content is an anti-pattern, because you're not going to have user context. You're not going to have identity. You're not going to know who's making those changes. You really do want to use user identity authentication for that, which is the most established pattern and most covered in our documentation. I think that's all we can probably take due to time. So thank you all.
We'll make ourselves available if anyone has any additional questions.